Okay, welcome to Chapter 20. We'll be looking at Africa and the slave trade between 1450 and 1750. Now, most of what Africa's interactions are with the Europeans and with the Arabs and the Muslims and even India revolves around slavery. It's not exclusively about slavery, and there's more going on in Africa than just slavery, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But for the most part, what we're going to be dealing with is what's going on in Africa with the slave trade. All right, first question. What was the influence of Europe upon Africa? I've got four things up here. First off, the path of Africa becomes linked to the European world economy. In other words, Africa is crucial, crucial to Europe's success in its colonies. It's got to have, and you can see on this map, they've got to have this slave trade to make Brazil and sugar and Caribbean and sugar and eventually cotton and tobacco in the Caribbeans and tobacco in North America. They've got to have slaves, and slaves become such an important part of this whole picture. Second, there's a diaspora. The diaspora is the mass exodus of people leaving a homeland. And Africa is going to experience this. At least 12 million people are taken out of Africa during this time period to cross the Atlantic Ocean to work on plantation slaves, as plantation slaves. Um, an interesting phenomenon, while it does take 12 million people out, it doesn't change the overall population. The overall population actually remains relatively constant. What it does change is the percentage of women to men. There are many more women than men. Slave trade dominated interactions both between the Arab Muslims and the Europeans and their dealings with Africa. But we're going to learn not all of Africa's impacted to the same degree. You can see already on this map, see the green where they're taking slaves out of here? South Africa is going to escape that, and we'll talk about that more later on. Okay, next up, the Atlantic slave trade. What was the pattern of slave trade in which the Portuguese established? What did they do? They, first off, they established fortified trading stations. They did not like, let me show you a picture of one of those. They did not like to stay in Africa very long. It's too hot, there's malaria. Europeans, to be honest, don't do real well down here. So they don't want a long-term or a large presence anyway. So they establish these slave fortifications where Africans would bring in slaves to sell to them, and then they would ship them out. Number two, they use a combination of force and diplomacy. There are not enough Europeans to force the Africans to do slave trading. So occasionally they use force, like fortifications and things like that. But a lot of it's diplomacy and money. They establish what's my bullet point number three here, alliances with local rulers. They say, hey, we'll make you rich, you make us rich, it'll be a good deal. And really, predominantly the interactions between Europeans and Africans is one of money. Money's the uniting factor. They want commercial relations. Next question. Um, what was the history of African slave trade? Slavery had existed bringing slaves out of Africa had existed as early as Roman times. It's really replaced by serfdom in the Middle Ages. Europe sort of dropped slavery during the Middle Ages, with the exception of, you guys remember we talked about it in a previous chapter, with the exception of where? That's right, Iberia. Portuguese and Spanish have been interacting with the Muslims there. They've been buying slaves from them, plus they've been acquiring some through war. Um, in 1441, this has become a common trade item, and trade actually becomes more effective for Europeans than raids. What Portugal steps into is this already existing slave trade here on the west coast. You can see it here in purple. What they'll do is they'll sail down here and buy slaves off these guys and off this empire. There's already been a slave trade across the Atlantic, and you'll see there's slave trade off the east coast of Africa. That already exists. So after 1441, the Portuguese begin to take slaves out. They don't engage in raiding. That's too expensive, too difficult. So instead, they will do business with them. Okay. What was the number of slaves across the Atlantic, and what was the reason for the high volume? Well, first off, bullet point number one, 1450 to 1850, 12 million slaves are shipped. You can see, I like this picture here. You can see how many of them, because it shows numbers. Not that many went to Spanish America. Some, not that many to British North America. Again, some. A lot of them to the British Caribbean, the French Caribbean, the Dutch Caribbean, and of course Brazil. Um, why? Slavery has a high mortality rate. Slavery kills a lot of people. Fertility is relatively low. One of the things you're going to learn is that down here in Brazil and the Caribbean, they don't take many women because they don't need many women. They take mostly men. Here's a drawing taken from this time period of a slave ship, and you'll notice that it's almost all men. Okay? Um, Reproduction rates are higher in the southern USA. Here it's different labor. It's not sugar plantations or mining like it is down here in Spanish America or here in the Caribbean or Brazil. Reproduction's encouraged, and it's a milder climate, so the mortality rate is lower. The survival rate is higher. Um, Down in Latin America, the concentration is much higher, particularly in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, the slaves or people, even free people of African descent plus slaves can add up to 80 to 90% of the population in Latin America, whereas it's never much more than 25% in British North America. Okay, what types of captives were taken? What's the demographic patterns? Well, first off, the trans-Saharan trade focused on women. You guys remember reading that, right? In that first outside reading we did, Slavery in Africa reading. You remember reading about that? Trans-Saharan focuses on women. They take men, but they focus on women. The Atlantic slave trade, however, focused on men. Why? Heavy labor, high mortality of children. They didn't want children. Children didn't survive the journey. Um, you got to wait till they grow up to start doing the heavy work of sugar plantations. See if I've got a picture of that. Yes, I do. Sugar plantations, you see how tall the sugar got. It's very labor intensive. They do use a few women, but in general, it's more likely to be men. Um, with capture, African tribes like to keep the women and children for themselves. So you see that it's predominantly men who will make the journey across the Atlantic. Okay, so what about the organization of slave trade? What were the connections between European and African traders? First off, we need to define a term, Indies piece. Indies piece is a basis of currency. It was equal to one adult male, and all prices were related to that. So you've got a picture here of these two guys with an African male. He would have been considered an Indies piece. Number two, they're brought to the coast. Usually African or mulatto agents purchase captives on the interior. This was a money-making scheme for everybody. Some kingdoms actually taxed the movement of slaves, like you might gold or any other commodity. Some states, some governments, African governments, tried to monopolize the trade. And really, it's a collaboration, to be honest. It's a collaboration of European and or African domination. It's not one or the other. Some Africans are clearly gaining on this slave trade, while the Europeans are clearly gaining on this slave trade. Okay? So next up, what about African society, slavery, and the slave trade? What were some of the unique aspects of African servitude? All right, first of all, this is African servitude. African. Enslavement of women is a central feature. They're used to extend lineage. That means to make your family larger. You want to extend your family lineage. It led to polygamy and harems. The Sudanic states, well, by that I mean the Muslim states, slavery was legal for non-believers. The idea was supposed to be illegal for Muslims. In other words, if I'm a Muslim and I take a non-believer slave, that's okay. If I take a non-believer, if I take a Muslim slave, that's frowned upon. But still, some Muslims were enslaved. African groups, ethnic groups, rarely enslaved their own people. They usually took from neighboring tribes or neighboring states. It was rarely from within your own state. And expanding states became major suppliers. Now, why do you think it is, guys? Why would an expanding state, in other words, an African country state that is conquering more and more people, more and more groups, why would they be a major source of slaves? That's right. That's right. Because you remember that when you conquer people, one of the rewards of conquering groups was you get to take more slaves. Okay, so next up, what was the impact on African politics of slave trade? Oh, here I've got, this is supposed to be a drawing from this time period of them taking, of Arab Muslims taking slaves out of Africa. Okay, sorry, I forgot that was there. All right, slaving in African politics. What were some of the unique aspects? A couple of unique aspects. Number one, Europe did not want any of the coastal states from gaining too much. Oh, that should have another O. I need to correct that. Too much political or economic power. Um, they tried to control, keep these weak enough because the fear was that if they became strong enough, the African states might cut the Europeans out of the slave trade. Also, interior kingdoms, they're the ones who gained a lot of power, and they turned to a cycle of guns for slaves. In other words, if I want to keep growing, I need more guns. In order to get more guns, I need to sell slaves. In order to get more slaves, I need to expand. So I need more guns. In order to get more guns, I've got to sell slaves. And it becomes a vicious cycle. I liked this picture because this shows the triangular trade. Slaves coming to the Americas, raw materials, tobacco, sugar, raw cotton, and furs headed to Europe. And then Europe sending cotton woolens, metal goods, and guns to Africa. Okay, this picture is just supposed to show you the idea that these are Africans who are taking other Africans slaves. And you'll notice what he's holding down here. He's holding guns. They bought the guns and the ammo off the Europeans. In return, they traded slaves to the Europeans. Okay, east coast of Africa and the Sudan. Okay. Um, Describe slavery in East Africa. In East Africa. All right. In East Africa, we've got the Swahili coast, which is the east coast of Africa. You remember Swahili is a combination of what two things? It's a language, and it comes to describe a group of people, and it describes what is a combination of what two languages? That's right, Arabic, and that one that was the big one that spread all over sub-Saharan Africa, that other language group, Bantu. Okay, these became commercial centers under the controls of Ottomans and Portuguese. Will both establish slave places here along the East Coast. Slave trade existed up until this point. It had been mostly to the harems of Arabia. The Portuguese established some plantations, and so they took some to those. Some island plantations, such as, if you did your homework, you know, the island plantation of Zanzibar will emerge off the coast of Africa, and the interior area was not as affected in Africa. Interior of Africa is less impacted. All right, this makes a great stopping spot for part one. Then we'll come back and do part two. Thank you.